Hi, we're just chatting along here. Welcome back to Issues That Matter. So glad that you're here. We're all about our viewers, so thank you. I am so excited to introduce our guest, but you can tell that there's somebody missing. The good news and bad news about yesterday's blizzard. The good news is Cecilia is going to be here long enough to do a part 1 and part 2. Yay, can't wait to introduce you to her. The bad news is Robert's power was out, like many of you in the southern Maine area. So he's unable to join us in front of the camera, but he is behind the camera causing trouble because that's how he rolls, you know. So I'm going to introduce you to Cecilia, and I'm going to read this because I don't want to mess it up. Celia Grand is a licensed clinical social worker, with 30 years experience. Celia is trained in a multitude of psychotherapy methods. She's a facilitator for the EMDR Institute, past trainer for the sensory motor psychotherapy, and currently assistant and clinical advisor for the Deirdre phase, you just talked about her, Safely Embodied. Celia is also a certified psychosynthesis.
Yeah. Psychosynthesis.
Did I do that right? Okay. A psycho-spiritual psychotherapy method and is trained in internal family systems. She's known in the Portland, Maine community as well as nationally and internationally as a trauma expert, which is why we have her here. Thank you so much for coming. So happy. In my, my circle of friends, Margaret DeRoss is the one that suggested that I give Cecilia a call, and then Kathy Jabalkowicz is like, she's amazing with trauma. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. And can I just say that my name is Celia,
Celia.
not Cecilia.
Thank you, Celia.
Yes, because then people will look for Cecilia.
Right.
Not
and
that it's offensive.
I was hearing the song Cecilia.
I know. That's what everybody thinks. I've gotten it my whole life.
Celia.
Yes,
well,
thank you.
Thank you. So we're gonna, since we have part 1 and part 2 today, part 1 will be sort of the 101, because there are lots of folks who have been traumatized themselves and love people who've been traumatized, and they just don't understand it. So we'll start sort of at the beginning, and then we'll just let it flow. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? We hear about that all the time. What is it?
Well, post-traumatic stress is an experience that happens after a trauma. And so if you've had a traumatic experience, it lasts longer than 3 months, it causes great distress, it disrupts your home life and your work life. And there's symptoms, so that long after the trauma could be a few weeks, it could be months, it could be years, that all of a sudden you have like intrusive thoughts, emotional dysregulation, nightmares, avoidance of being fearful and avoidance of certain stimuli, like going out in crowds or, you know, not wanting to do things that you used to do that was pleasurable.
So can I ask you about the trauma itself?
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of going to play the devil's advocate
Sure.
on this. So, you know, I think when some people think of post-traumatic stress disorder, they think about a soldier who has seen action. You know, they've seen somebody get blown up, and that's what post-traumatic stress is. But really,
so there's 2 types of trauma. One we call event trauma, which is something like combat vets, car accidents, physical or sexual abuse, natural disasters, health, medical traumas. And though that's caused that something happened to you. And then the other piece of trauma that we now know is called attachment trauma.
Attachment trauma.
And attachment, developmental, relational trauma, and that type of trauma is about missing experiences. So both types of trauma affect the brain, and I'll talk about how they affect differently, but attachment trauma happens in utero to about age 3 as our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, is developing, and we get an imprint of how we experience the world. And so the trauma symptoms for developmental trauma will be emotional dysregulation, not feeling safe in the world, not thriving in life, not going for joy and what you really want. It's, you know, you hold yourself back. And most people who have relational trauma or developmental trauma, attachment trauma, have relationship issues. And 1 in 4 people have attachment trauma. And in event trauma, there's only about 30% of the population that will get from a life experience out of the ordinary experience will get post-traumatic stress disorder.
So I'm confused on the first trauma. So it's not something that happens to you, it's an imprint through your surrounding.
Well,
can I have an example of that?
Yeah, because this is the piece that most people don't get.
Yeah, and 1 in 4.
1 in 4, yes. And so it's about having missing experiences. And I'm not sure if they can show the slide about a secure base. This is my friend Deirdre Fay's work. If we have a secure base, right, when we come out of the womb, we don't have a prefrontal cortex. So there's 3 parts of the brain. Let me start back. Let me go back a little bit. So our reptilian brain, that's our impulse. That's our hunger, our need for sleep. But it's also where the parts of the brain that signal danger.
Okay.
So most of us know about fight-flight response.
Right.
And when we have an event trauma, that old reptilian brain gets activated.
Right.
And what's post-trauma and event trauma is that it never shuts off.
Right.
And we never want that to go away. We just need it to shut down.
Yes.
Okay. But with developmental trauma, when we've gotten enough caretaking from caregivers,
right,
we feel a sense of safeness in the world and a safeness from inside.
Right. So the baby's
comes out of right.
So the baby who's born and maybe for whatever reason isn't getting their needs met as that infant. Right.
So like most people who've had a child read their baby's cries.
Yeah.
They know when the baby's hungry, they know when the baby needs sleep, it needs to be diapered, it needs to be tended to. And if a caregiver doesn't provide that, or they're inconsistent in it, then the baby doesn't get that secure base. And when we don't have a secure base, we can't go and explore the world. Or when we have an emotion, that a caregiver will regulate through eye gaze. Like the research shows that a mother will hold a baby 18 inches away from them, and that regulates emotion. Yeah. And if you don't have that, then the baby learns strategies for coping. They learn to shut down because the central nervous system is activated, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen some videos on YouTube or something about babies, toddlers, and the mothers who make eye contact with the baby. What happens when they don't? What happens when they do?
Well, there's a great guy out of Boston. His name is Ed Tronick, and he did studies with...
Ed Tronick?
Tronick, Tronick. Okay. And he works with opioid and drug addicted mothers and helping them repair the attachment wound because those babies didn't get that tending to.
Right.
So a baby will create strategies. So some people have heard, you know, in the literature about parentified children. The child starts to learn strategies to regulate the mother.
So that the mother can meet the need of the child.
Right.
My dogs do the same thing. They've got me totally trained.
Right.
So I understand.
Exactly.
I understand that. So, and that's sort of a really cool and wonderful, groovy thing about babies, right? Is the resilience. So if a mother maybe was addicted and now she's clean and able to be a mom while the baby is still a baby. That mother can relearn how to engage and connect with that child and maybe undo anything that was done.
Or minimize the symptoms, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Right. And so attachment trauma is really about missing experiences or misattunement. That's what we're talking about, attunement, or neglect, emotional abuse, or abandonment.
Yeah.
And so And the reason why event trauma often doesn't resolve is because there's underlying attachment trauma. So people who come to my office and they've had a bad experience, even say physical or sexual abuse as a child, and they've told their story a gazillion times, but they go, it doesn't resolve because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
Right? You don't know that something that you're needed to become a healthy adult. And I just want to say also, we're hardwired as a species for goodness.
Yeah.
For kindness, for loving, to love and be loved. And even if we don't feel that, we're wired that way. And so working with the attachment trauma brings you back to that native true self. Does that make sense?
It does. And what's interesting, what's coming up for me around this is, two adults, and one adult has a horrific one-time event trauma, and then the other person has a less traumatic event, and maybe the one with the severe trauma handles it better, recovers better, and to an outsider we would say, well, how come this person has had way better, worse stuff than you, is doing great? What's wrong with you? Buck up, Sally, or whatever.
Exactly.
And what we don't know about those two is what happened to them at that in utero to 3 years old.
Right.
And that's sort of a key element to this, right?
Exactly. So around 2000, I was on this the EMDR International Association board. So I was hobnobbing with all the big heads in the psychotherapy world, and neuroscience was just really coming on into play. And I had that question. I was like, we know about people who were abused or have car accidents or natural disasters or grow up in like torturous countries.
Yeah.
And they seem to kind of fare well. But then there's these people who are doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs who look good, smell good, sound good, but they can't deal with a relationship.
Right.
They're, they alienate their coworkers. Like, what's that about, right? And then there's people who, collapse, right? And so what's the difference between the people who collapse, the people who look good, sound good, smell good, but they're not thriving in life? They look good, but they're not really thriving. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm wondering...
And that's the developmental trauma or attachment.
Got it. And so what I'm wondering, if this is the place that we should bring in ACE. ACEs.
Yes. Go ahead.
So I am sort of being the Lorax about ACEs right now, because I think that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is mind-blowing. To me, it is the vaccine for polio, that this is just the bang. Understanding that when children are neglected, abused, traumatized in any way, from that birth to 18, I guess that's what they're saying is 18-year period, that not only does it affect them emotionally, but that it actually affects their biology, which is amazing. And so people who can't get their blood sugar regulated, their blood pressure regulated, and this is just ding, 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 let's let the sirens go off. Pain medication. So from what I understand, I read this sentence and I loved it. We're not experiencing an opioid epidemic. We are experiencing a high ACE score epidemic. Please talk about this.
I would love to talk about this, because Kaiser Permanente just started to do a study because they wanted to lower the insurance cost. And they realized...
It's all about money.
It all is always about money. But this is one good thing that the insurance industry has done.
Yeah.
So they found that children from abuse and neglect had higher incidence of health-related issues or early death. So how I kind of think about it is, so the second part of our brain is called the midbrain, and that's our emotional brain that's tied to our limbic system. And when we're in a stress response, our HPA system, which is the hypothalamus, adrenals, and pituitary, And when you're in a stress response, you get a cascade of neurochemicals, and that cascade through your body. So most of us know about, because we've been on diets or whatnot, about adrenaline going up, and then the body throws in cortisol, and then you have a little belly fat, right? But when a child grows up with that, their body's in a chronic stress response. So their biology is being altered. There's also a notion called epigenetics. And epigenetics is that we have free radical stem cells, and that we're wired for adaptation. So then
we are wired for adaptation.
Just as a species. Like, that's why, you know, I could go into evolution, but we're wired for adaptation. So the body will adapt. And then your whole system is now off skew. And so another slide, I don't know if they have this, is called the window of tolerance. When we have an experience, and we were saying earlier that we can't predict life on life. Life is a mystery.
Life is a mystery.
Life is a mystery.
Life is a mystery. And for a traumatized person like myself, life as a mystery can be terrifying, because if we're just waiting for, as you said, the other shoe to drop,
right?
Or even if there's something good that happens, we're afraid that it's going to be. I mean, it took me 3 years to believe I owned my house when I bought it at 40.
Right.
You know, I kept, did I really buy this? They're going to take it away. Right. You know, so that's sort of life as a traumatized person in the world of life is a mystery.
And we don't know how to live in uncertainty.
We don't know how to live in uncertainty.
But what we do know about emotional regulation, because this is going to tie in the ACE study, that within a certain window, right, where of tolerance. So in order for us to grow and change, we need a little level of anxiety. So the HPA axis goes up, and then the cortisol comes in, and emotion is like a bell curve. And if we're within a certain window, we can think, we can feel, and we can act. But what happens when your system is now wired because of chronic stress, living under chronic stress, hence why a lot of kids get ADHD diagnoses when they're traumatized. The new one is the Asperger's, because they're really traumatized children. Anyways, they go above the window, and that's called hyperarousal. That's anxiety, rapid heart rate, not being able to think, sweaty palms. And when you're hyper aroused, eventually the system goes, we can't take this high adrenaline in the system, we're going to go into freeze. And freeze, right, fight, flight, freeze, freeze is high anxiety with immobility. You can't move, you're like stuck. And then the system goes, I can't do this, so then it goes below the window, and that's called hypoarousal. And hypoarousal is when you're shut down. It's a feeling of depression, chronic depression that medication doesn't work for, doesn't yield, doesn't help. Or feigned death, you just collapse, and dissociation. And so
hold on for just 1 second. So when we just had the Olympics.
Right.
So before the Olympic athlete is going to do their event, having sweaty palms and your heart pounding and that feeling of excitement is the fuel that you just go or whatever you're doing. That's a good thing. We get that before public speaking. We get that before we're going to give it whatever. And that is it's sort of a little edge that pushes us to expand and grow and evolve.
Right.
Right.
But also the Olympian has trained that energy.
Yeah.
So there was a study of tennis players, and I can't remember who the tennis players were, but the top 10, just to make the story short, the top 10 all had the same skill set. They were elite tennis players, but one of them in between sets would stroke their racket.
Oh.
So that they would then down-regulate that adrenaline flow.
Yeah.
And so you'll see the athlete, the football player or the basketball player or the Olympian wearing headsets.
Yeah.
They're either training their mind to do what they know they need to do, or they're down-regulating that anxiety that gets them too up.
Yeah.
Right? But they're in the window.
Right.
Because they've trained it.
And so if they stayed there,
exactly,
then that is where the trouble comes. Right.
Not come. If they're in the window, they're able to think,
yeah.
feel,
But if
and
they
act.
stay there, that is
If
when...
they go above the window.
Yeah, okay.
If they go, oh my God, they have a thought that goes, oh, I'm not going to be able to get down this mountain.
Right.
It's a skier, right?
Right.
Now their adrenaline is going.
Yeah.
And then they think about the last time they fell.
Yeah.
Or the time that they didn't make whatever, you know, they didn't make their gate or whatever.
Yeah.
That then they start thinking that, and they go into hyperarousal.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But for a trauma survivor, here's the thing.
They stay there.
No, their window can be very small. Their ability to regulate emotion, the more trauma, the more neglect, the narrower the window. So in treatment, we have to sometimes grow the window so there's more affect, what we call affect tolerance. Because their window is small and they go 0 to 100 into adrenaline.
Yep.
Or they go 0 to 100 into dissociation.
Yep.
And that's what the ACE studies really started to hardwire for us, is that children who grow up in abusive homes are not going to be able to tolerate or regulate their emotion.
I want to ask you about disassociation.
Yep.
That word is used many times. What is it?
The simplest way to, because it's a very complex defense mechanism. It's just a defense mechanism that we all are wired to have. And what it means is you don't stay present. You're not in present experience. And so there's another guy, his name is Stephen Porges, and he talks...
Stephen Porges?
Porges. And he talks about the central nervous system. And I think this is, I heard this many years ago, so I don't know where the hard science is behind it, but I heard in the context of his work that babies don't have a dissociative mechanism yet. So if they go into those arousal cycles and they don't dissociate, they can die. So dissociation helps us from death. It helps us, it's a defense mechanism, because when the system goes into that shutdown, all the blood goes into your organs. And because the body's going, we got to preserve the body.
Right.
And the brain goes, okay, we're in preservation mode.
Right.
And if we don't dissociate with that high intensity of emotional dysregulation, hyperarousal to hypoarousal, and we don't dissociate, then the body is now cued in to say, we're in survival.
Right.
Like we're like, this is life or death.
So when you say that, what I hear is the Star Trek movie, and I hear Captain Kirk telling Scotty to take all available energy.
That's right.
To put the thing around the hull.
Right.
Right. Right. So that's basically what the body is doing. It's like all energy is going to the core to protect the life of the human being.
Right. So dissociation becomes a defense mechanism, because now the central nervous system is 2 branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now the body, it's not, we call that subcortical. You're not thinking about this. This just happens.
Right.
It's patterned in you.
And where's the thoughts going? So that's what the body is doing with disassociation. What's the mind doing?
Well, the mind can have ruminating thoughts, like, and it's usually some persecutory or negative self-esteem kind of thoughts, like I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, and the brain is just like sort of just going, like I call it, like a deep curve, like a deep groove in the brain, and it just stays stuck in a pattern. Or the mind leaves. So dissociation can be anywhere in between. So like you and I could be in a conversation and there could be a part of me that's totally checked out. And then all of a sudden you're back in the conversation and go, oh, what was just happening?
The reason why I'm asking is Dee Clark with Survivors Speak, an advocacy group in Maine. She talks a lot about disassociation in educating police officers who might be arresting somebody who's being trafficked,
right,
or an abuse. So in a traffic situation, a police officer might be talking to a woman that is being, they call it sextortion. She's being sexually exploited.
Right. And
he's talking to her, asking her, where do you live? You know, whatever questions. And she might be right there looking at him, talking to him, but she is not there. And what it might look like to the police officers, it might look like she's lying.
Right.
Because her eyes are going up. And
Right.
I know for me, when I'm trying to remember my story or something, I'm searching for, for it.
Going back to Porges' work, what he says is that we're, as a species, need social engagement. That's what separates us from the animal. So if somebody, like in that scenario, a police officer, if he just said to her, look in my eyes, and if he is calm, right, and grounded, her system, we have what they call motor neurons. Our brains are almost like, it's almost like a psychic energy, for lack of a better word. And so if I'm calm and grounded and I say, just look at me, just stay with me for a moment. I know you've been through a really hard time right now. I know that you're really scared. I'm a safe person. And if that sex trafficked person is getting that level of care and tending, she's going to come back into herself. She's going to become embodied. And
love it.
Right, and my friend Deirdre Fay in Safely Embodied works, her beginning work is really teaching people how to get back in their bodies.
So important.
So dissociation is a disembodiment.
Right.
Right?
So I love this. Disassociation is a disembodiment.
Right. Of thoughts, emotions, and our somatic, our sensory.
Love that. And for the police, law enforcement that are watching, when you are dealing with a traumatized person, Celia is saying, look into their eyes and say, look into my eyes. I'm a safe person. I know you've been through a lot, but stay here with me and we can get through this together.
Right.
I love that.
And there's going to be a greater likelihood, but now the eyes will dart.
Yeah.
So like when I work with a highly traumatized person, I'm kind of going like,
right, trying to get their eyes. I love that. That's beautiful, Celia.
But that, if we go back to what I said earlier, we're wired for that.
Yeah.
Because that mother holds her baby 18 inches away and is regulating regulating the baby's emotion. When we're in love, we gaze in each other's eyes. If you're in a partnership and you guys are fighting all the time, eye gaze is one thing you can do. You don't have to talk about it. You have to look in each other's eyes and just say, you know what, let's not do this to each other.
Yeah.
You know, and then the attachment system can come online. But if you're like, rah, 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 I'm fighting and your eyes are darting all over the place, that's where violence starts.
Yeah. So a way to de-escalate a fight with your partner or with a family member, somebody in your intimate circle, is to just call a timeout where you just look into each other's eyes.
And maybe even just say, let's not do this to each other.
Let's not do this to each other.
Or you have a child who's having a temper tantrum or has behaviors that, you want to just pull your hair out. You just take a deep breath, you ground yourself, and you say, hey, Sally, look at me. Just look at mommy right now. Yeah. Or look at daddy. Look at me.
My girlfriend was telling me about her 14-year-old daughter yesterday. What about that? Would that work for the 14-year-old daughter?
Well, the 14-year-old daughter, it might be depending on where they are in the scenario, right? Because in teenage, this goes into another level of like understanding us as a human being. Right. But she's protesting. She's getting her I am, right?
Yeah.
So if the mother said to her, I know you don't like this right now, but can we just pause for a moment? Yeah. Can you just look at me? Let's just pause.
Yeah.
And tell me all about it. Tell me what is going on with you. Now, most people will go like, oh yeah, that's going to happen with a 14-year-old. Yeah. But it's a lot better than the alternative.
Right. So the ACEs is so cool because it's really taking the other researchers that you've talked about and really has taking that science to another level.
Right.
So the people who do have high ACE scores, who've endured trauma as young people, their window might be smaller, narrower than somebody else.
So they have less tolerance
So they
to
have
deal
less
with
tolerance
emotions.
to deal with emotions.
And when the uncertainty, the mystery of life happens, they go 0 to 100.
Yeah, and
Instead
so
of-
they might go hyper or hypo.
Right.
Yeah.
And if they've gone hypo, it's now patterned. We always go hyper first.
Yeah.
But if someone goes automatically into dissociation, we're now, you know, that's more of a complex PTSD.
Yeah.
It's been pervasive abuse. If you go right into dissociation, there's pervasive, long-standing abuse.
Yeah.
And so you just shut down. You just tune out. If your mother has been dismissive, you never amount to anything, your father didn't give two hoots about you, and you just learned, I got to buck up and I've got to move on in life, then you expect people to be dismissive. And you just sort of shut down. And that's a level of dissociation. You go into a hypo, you pull back, I'm not going to deal with this.
Right.
As opposed to...
And kind of perpetuates, doesn't it?
It does, it does. That's the epigenetics.
Yeah,
right?
right.
And I was saying to Bob earlier, I was reading this, I was reading the other day about zebras. And when baby zebras are born, they study the stripes on the mother because, believe it or not, all zebra stripes are different.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
No, that's interesting.
And then, and that's how they know who their mother is, because they study the zebra stripes.
Huh.
And baby birds will study the, or listen to their mother's calls, and that's how they know that they're, that who their mother is. And they call that biological imprinting. And that's what happens to us. So through the attachment process, through the way our parents related, through the way the family system related, and then how we went out in the world, we have an imprint. And if we are, so when we go into adulthood, we go into the world with this imprint. So as a child, and what we know about ACE, a child is dependent from a caregiver outside themselves in order to be whole. But if you go into adulthood and you're not whole, it's our adult task to learn from the inside to undo that imprint, change that zebra print, and make the one that you are wired for. Because if you go back to what I originally said, we're wired for the goodness, for love,
Right.
for kindness, for compassion as a species. That's what we are supposed to be. That's our true nature.
So what I would want to, there's one ask and then one story. So the ask is, so let's say the mother is neglectful, absent, whatever, but there's a grandmother or an aunt or somebody else in the family. This is why I think it's so important for us to mother and love all children everywhere. Can those other people, and male, the father, a brother, an uncle, can they fulfill that need in the child?
Yes, because a child needs an older, wiser person to help guide. So, and usually there is someone. Usually, unless there's really horrific neglect. But even if you never had that, we know. The research is out there that we know what we're supposed to have.
Yeah.
And what again, Deirdre says is when a child, the 14-year-old teenager, she's protesting. A protest isn't a bad thing when a kid misbehaves or even as an adult, because what we're saying is it shouldn't be this way.
Right.
Because we know it shouldn't be this way.
Right.
And usually under a protest is a need.
Right.
Right? And what we need is what we long for or what we want.
I wanted to, that brings me to something that I I volunteer at Long Creek Youth Center. And I'm just going to see if I'm saying this the right way. No, you're ruining the children in Long Creek. What I tell the girls is, okay, your mother is awful, your father is awful, whatever. What are the ways in your life that you are mothered, to have eyes that see the way the universe does love you and does mother you, sister you, friend you. That was very helpful for me, is to say, okay, you know, I accept and love my mother for who she is, and she's never going to be the kind of mother that whatever
you needed
know,
and
that I
wanted.
needed. Right. So that didn't happen. It's never going to happen. But what a wonderful life I have, that I have so many people in my life that meet that need today, and I look for it and I hone that skill to see it.
Well, this is the beauty of our brains. Our brain, there's a notion called neuroplasticity, and that helped. Our brains are also wired to change. We don't stay the same. You're not the same person you were last week.
Right.
Right? But if you had, when someone has that realization, and the other thing too is, it's in one of the books that I recommend is Bruce Eckert's book, Unlocking the Emotional Brain. He says that the brain, once you have that realization that, you know, your mother wasn't the mother you needed, but there are other people, the brain can't hold two opposing states at the same time. They can't. It can't. And it will always go towards the curative.
I like that.
Yeah, isn't it? That's another neuroscience that we're now.
Keep that one.
Yeah. And so when you work with the Long Creek girls and you say, not only can you take in the people who are kind to you, and then you can take that, and that can be part of you. You don't have to be your mother, your father, the abuser. You don't have to be that.
You can choose.
Right, but you have to feel it.
Yeah.
You have to feel, can they feel you giving them whatever you give them when you work with them? Can they take it in? And that's usually the work of a trauma therapist, is helping people learn how to take it in.
Yeah, right.
Because that's the hard part.
That is the hard part.
Right.
Because like you said, I've never gotten it, and I'm just going to buck up.
Right, I'm just going to pull back. But if you can't take it in, then you're just going to keep doing what you do.
Right. I want to ask you about the story that I heard from law enforcement. He told a story of gorillas, and he said the research was done in this research facility, and they had some gorillas, and they put them in this big room, and they put bananas in the middle of the room. And whenever the gorillas went over to the bananas, they took these fire hydrants that was just a, force that would just knock them over. And every time the gorillas would go to eat the bananas, they would turn on the hose. So the gorillas learned not to go for the bananas. So then they brought in some more gorillas, and then whenever the new gorillas would start to go towards the bananas, the other gorillas would be like, no,
exactly,
don't go near the bananas, because we don't want to see you get hosed. Then they took out the original gorillas, and now there's just the second level, and then they bring in the third one, and the same thing happened. Right. And so what they were trying to show is, the grandparents who went through, back in during the Depression, that the trauma that they went through, even though their children didn't go through it, they got some of the same traits, and then go ahead.
That's the epigenetics.
That's the epigenetics.
And that it can actually change, in some of the literature, it says it actually changes the genetic code.
Yes.
And so this woman named Rachel Yehuda, with a Y, Yehuda, and I don't know, I think she's just in the literature, I've seen her speak. She studied Holocaust survivors. Yeah. And it's the same as the gorillas. Yeah. That the generations took on the tendencies. Right. Right? And it's also the attachment. So you have a change in the DNA, and now you have a new attachment pattern that is against our natural self, right? Our nature. And so, and then it becomes, and when Bob and I were talking about violence, with children and violence and the guns that are happening, the kids who are, going into the schools, Parkland, they grew up in violence. You know, so there's an intergenerational violent pattern 9 out of 10 times. Like there's violence in the home.
There's violence in the home.
And so now that violent trait is passed on.
Yeah.
And now you have also neglect and abuse. And now that not only is that gene has been altered, now you have someone set up for violence.
Right. It's a recipe for disaster.
It's a recipe for disaster. And what I said to Bob was that, you know, these people who are violent like that, they're usually sociopathic or psychopathic. They don't show up. The culture is saying, like, right, the culture is saying we need mental health intervention, but those people don't show up. Right. The people who experience pain because they know that something isn't right, they show up for therapy.
Yeah. But
not the people who go, hey, I want that, I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
Because I want it.
I'm going to, they've done me wrong, and I have a gun, and I'm going to shoot people because you've done me wrong, and this is what you've got coming.
Right. So like another one is like gang violence. I was listening to a guy who's being interviewed who's going into the ghettos and helping gangs. And he was a gang member and went to jail and came back somehow rehabilitated and wants to help the gangs. When he was a gang member, there was a purpose, there was a mission, there was a way that they were an insular community that they protected. And he said the gangs now, they just don't like the way you look or the sneakers you're wearing, and they just shoot them.
Yeah.
So the gangs before there was a mission.
Family.
It was a family. They were protecting it for good, bad, or ugly. And now the gangs are just about, I don't like what you did, I'm going to shoot you.
Yeah.
So
I think that it's so important for people to do their work. And when I get asked, you know, what can we do? I remember when the Dalai Lama years ago did a peacemaking tour.
Yes.
I think he did California, Denver, and New York. And I went to that. And I was so humbled, and I was almost, I almost wanted to leave the event because I felt so unworthy around all of these people who were doing such amazing things. And it was like the Dalai Lama, you know, His Holiness, was reading my mind, because he spoke. We had group events and then breakout sessions. And in the group event, he said, you know, you're around all these wonderful people, but everybody can change the world. And how you change the world is with the person you see in the mirror.
right.
When you have loving kindness for the person in the mirror, you know, you start off with, I want to love and accept you the way you are.
Right.
Into your own eyes, looking into your own eyes,
Right.
which is what you just said.
Right.
So that's so cool. Now I get that,
Yes.
right? And then when you want to, I love and accept you just the way you are, just looking into your own eyes. And he said, once you have loving kindness for that person, then you go with your mate or your parent
That's
or
right.
your roommate. And he said, it's like throwing a stone into water, and it just ripples out and ripples out and ripples out. So the way we can change our community, change our home, change the world is by starting with helping yourself,
Right.
by doing your own work. So when I'm asked, Catherine, what can we do? I say, do your own work, so
Right.
that we can break that, what would you call it, the something that's passed down?
The epigenetic tendency.
Epigenetic.
The epigenetic.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I can see in my own family, from my mother to me, to my daughter, to my granddaughter, as we each do our own work, how it just gets better and better.
And our own work is 50%. It is when that pebble ripples, and we are a community.
I love that.
And
love that.
right, and we need community to ultimately heal.
Yeah.
So we heal ourselves, and then we find loving partners, or two partners if they've been together for a really long time, and they say, let's give up the fight.
Yeah.
Let's just start loving each other and be loving and kind to each other.
Yeah.
Then that grows a little bit more, and then people start to experience. You don't have to do anything. You have to be. You have to be a loving and kind person and compassionate person in order to change yourself and change the world.
So the people who've been traumatized, who are in, I'll just say the beginning of the trauma work, not necessarily somebody who's further along down the line,
Sure.
but sort of you know, they recognize they've been traumatized and maybe they're in and out of some sort of therapy. Their work is sort of dysfunctional, their friendships are sort of dysfunctional, they feel sort of dysfunctional. Maybe they're on some medication for anxiety and depression. And they're just sort of in that, and they're wanting to do the next step up. What is the next step for them? How can someone in that, I say that because the people that I work with, that's usually where they're at, you know, and they're wanting to move forward, but what's first, the chicken or the egg? Do they get better friends, you know, and then they, or how do they sort of, they're sort of stuck.
Right, so the other way to think about it too is how you said, if you can look in the mirror and love yourself, but most trauma survivors can't do that. So Janae, who was a theorist for psychotherapy around the time of Freud, so we're going, what, 135 to 50 years ago, said we heal trauma in 3 phases. We heal trauma in 3 phases. 3 phases. So the first phase is, oh God, I had a little mental block. Here it is.
I have those all the time. It's called menopause.
Oh, I hear you. Stabilization. Stabilization. And that's when you learn how to be in your body and be able to get in that window and learn skills to learn how to deactivate that arousal cycle. The second is reprocessing the trauma, and that is the story and the emotional reactivity and how our physiology gets activated over and over, and we reprocess how it's been downloaded in the brain. And then reintegration is when we restore, we test out our new behaviors, we start to thrive instead of just survive. And so
I love that. And so it sounds like we're starting to move into treatment, which will be our part 2. And I can see that our part 1 time is about up.
Perfect.
And so on our part 1, what is trauma? We understand now that there's 2 different kinds of trauma.
Yep.
And we understand that there's a biological aspect of trauma, that it really does affect every part of our being. And now we're going to move into part 2, but in closing part 1, is there anything that you would like to leave us with on part 1 that you haven't said that we just need to remember?
Oh dear, I don't think so. I think we've kind of covered a really good ground.
Awesome. You rock. This is it. That time just went by so fast. It did go by fast. Okay, so we're going to say goodbye to part 1, and what is trauma? We know what it is now. And we're going to end this segment, but stay tuned for segment 2 when we're going to talk about various treatments for trauma. So thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.